You. Good afternoon, students and guests of the Saturday School program. My name is Kathy Reddick. I'm president of the Cambridge NAACP. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you today Harvard Law School's Jesse Clemenco Professor of Law, Charles Ogletree. For those of you who have had the pleasure of knowing Professor Ogletree, or as some of you call him, Tree, you know that he's committed to fighting for the rights of people all over the world. Professor Ogletree is a dedicated husband, father, friend, and teacher. His reputation for taking a hard look at complex issues of law is well known both here in the States and abroad. This past September, Charles attended the UN Conference on Racism held in Durban, South Africa. And before the tragedies that occurred in New York, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania on September 11th, Charles was making his way back to Harvard from out west to present to you here his views on the controversial conference. Charles has stated that he's declared that the conference had some successes and it also had some failures. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming your professor, Charles Ogletree, to the podium.
Thank you, my dear. Kathy, thank you very much. I'm delighted to see such a large gathering of folks about this topic. And I'm going to talk for a while, and I'm going to try to answer as many of your questions as possible. In the spirit of the First Amendment, this is a free and uninhibited discussion about the issue, so I'm going to tell you what I believe happened and why, and at the same time give you a chance to agree or disagree. And as is consistent with the things that I do, I handed out two pieces of homework. One is an article I wrote just before the conference, published in the Los Angeles Times, criticizing the United States' position of not being at the World Conference, finding the position indefensible in many respects to not attend a world conference on racism. And then a second article that I have available is a piece that's just published this morning on Africana.com, is my reactions to and thoughts about the events of September 11, 2001, and then more recently, the events that have transpired since the bombing of Afghanistan this past weekend and this week. I think you will draw the conclusion, whether you agree with it or not, from my remarks, is that there is a relationship between what happened and did not happen in South Africa this summer and fall and what has happened since September 11th. And the relationship will be drawn from a number of perspectives by a number of people based on your sort of world point of view. Let me say something else. I mean, this standing here on October 11th brings back some actually haunting memories for me, because it was precisely 10 years ago, not in this room, but upstairs in the Ames courtroom, that I addressed a very large assemblage of Harvard faculty, staff, and students about another issue that many thought brought into question our commitment to principles of constitutionalism as opposed to principles of politics and power. 10 years ago to the day, I just returned from the longest weekend in my life. That's when I went to Washington to represent Professor Anita Hill in preparing for her testimony and defending her character when she testified against Clarence Thomas when he was nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court. It's actually 10 years ago today that occurred. And it was an interesting response coming back to Harvard Law School. I couldn't have picked a worse time, I think, to be drafted by Professor Hill to be her lawyer. In 1991, I was an untenured professor. I was on research leave working on an article for the Harvard Law Review criticizing the Rehnquist Court, and I actually had my galleys traveling with me when I went down to Washington, expecting to go down, prepare her as a witness, and come back and continue my work on the galleys. Well, a number of events transpired, as you know. In fact, Professor Hill asked if I would be her lead counsel for a number of reasons that are as relevant today as they were then. They are relevant because as many people who came to Professor Hill's defense, there was a noticeable absence of one particular group. It was an absence of African-American men supporting Professor Hill. White women supported her, black women supported her, and understood what was going on, but black men were sort of silent. In fact, they were more than silent. Some of them questioned whether or not she should ever have come forward. Some of them tried to discourage her from giving her testimony, and some of them tried to explain away Clarence Thomas's conduct as, you know, it's simply talk. It's simply a guy trying to hit on a girl. Why should we get all excited about this? And so it was important for me to respond to her request to represent her and to show that the issue of sexual harassment did not have gender boundaries. It's not something of interest just to men or women, black or white, rich or poor, young or old, but a universal concern that we addressed 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, as I said then, a little bit more emphatic than I might say today, is that there's no question that I believe Professor Hill, and it was shameful, not just Republicans, but Democrats and Republicans, who failed to come to her aid when she testified. And I was as critical then of the Arlen Specters and the Orrin Hatches, but I was also critical of the Ted Kennedys and the Joe Bidens and the Democrats, who I think rolled over and didn't really seriously examine Justice Thomas's records, and who accepted his plea when he said, when he walked from the federal courthouse past the jail, he thought, but for the grace of God go I, that he felt empathy for the African-American prisoners in the prison system. Well, we found out very quickly that he didn't care about them too much. And in fact, his opinions and his views for the last 10 years are getting sharper, more caustic, and I think more reactionary and more damaging to the idea of the Constitution. As I said, today the First Amendment is in the building, and I'm going to express my views. You should feel free to express yours. But that was 10 years ago, and it just reminded me of a challenge that we faced then, what would happen to the court, and it has, in some respects, held together, even though we've been disappointed with some of the appointments. I was wondering how I would be received coming back to Harvard in October of 1991. And it finally occurred to me, as much as my colleagues might have been troubled that I'm in Washington involved in a highly political case when I'm on research leave, that they weren't as critical as I expected them to be. And I think the reason was that there is a climate at Harvard Law School is that they weren't so critical of me representing Anita Hill. I think the biggest concern was, you know, Clarence Thomas, I think I'm better than he is for the court. And so I wasn't on the wrong side because of the personal perspectives of so many of my clients, and so some of my colleagues, so that was very helpful. And they still feel that way. I mean, their views haven't changed.